Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and like an author emotionally torturing their characters for your entertainment, I'll be putting myself through the ringer by reading 1-star reviews for my favorite sci-fi books. And just quickly, I want to thank Ian Goobley for the inspiration for this video. I'm going to leave a link to his channel in the description so you guys can go check it out. Alright, let's see what Goodreads has in store for me, starting with Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Second worst book I've ever read. Dude creates a monster just because, and then just leaves? And then everything goes wrong and he's surprised? Pull it together, Victor, what the heck? Okay, you're not entirely wrong here. This is a fairly fair description of Victor, but that is what the book is exploring, man's hubris, the dangers of scientific and technological exploration, and sometimes we're maybe not fully thinking about the consequences of these particular pursuits. Also, this is quite the mystery you've created. Second worst book you've ever read? What's the first? I mean, I feel like this is an inaccurate but intriguing review. I expected so much more of this. I honestly thought this was going to be sinister and thrilling, but nope. I really had to force myself to finish this one. It's probably due to the writing style that was typical for books of that age. So this is somewhat of a valid criticism, or at least a reasonable reaction to have, because yes, the book isn't actually that sinister or horrifying. If you're expecting a horror based on Frankenstein's depiction in pop culture, you might be a little bit surprised by how thoughtful and philosophical Frankenstein's monster is. And yes, the prose can be a little bit hard to get into as someone that doesn't read a ton of classics. It took me about 30-40 pages to adapt to it, but I did adapt to it and ended up loving the writing style, but I can see why it might not be for everyone. Ugh, I hate this book, and I've been forced by high school to read it twice, and college to read it once. So this is a pretty funny situation. I'm sorry this happened to you, whoever wrote this. The thought that someone read Frankenstein in high school, didn't like it, and then maybe moved schools or took another English class and was like, phew, at least I don't have to read Frankenstein. Oh, it's Frankenstein again? Great. Well, alright, I'm going to college. I'm off to college now. No more high school We're doing Frankenstein in college as well. Dang it. An annoying scientist and an ugly tall man fight over who is more depressed. I mean, this is pretty accurate. I don't disagree with this description at all. I just liked it more than you, I guess? Alright, moving on. Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. Rarely have I been more disappointed by a book than I was by this one. It builds up well, it's an acceptable build-up, up until 75% in, when it goes into a new age delirium that shocked me. So this is an interesting one because there was a period of time in science fiction where paranormal elements such as telekinesis or precognition were kind of considered part of the genre, and science fiction has kind of moved away from that since. And this might bother some people. You might prefer Clarke's harder sci-fi. For me, while I'm typically drawn more to the sci-fi than arguably fantastical elements, I think Clarke pulled it off in a way that to me, I emotionally resonated with. So I can see why for some people it might not be their favorite Clarke book, but I think he stuck the landing. The ocean is so big and my raft is so small. Clarke takes a godlike stance on storytelling, and I'm afraid my ability to head hop has diminished with age. I enjoyed this at first and then was lost. Having also DNF'd 2010, I'm confident that for me, this author doesn't translate well to audiobook. So I can't speak to the audiobook experience. I did read this in paperback format, but I do agree that Clarke in some ways takes a godlike stance to storytelling. It can be rather zoomed out, and if you're more of a character-driven reader, that might not resonate with you. But I like the scale, I like the scope, I like just how massive the ideas feel. That's what draws me to Clarke in the first place. So this wasn't a problem for me. A lot of it read too much like Clarke saying, "This is what the world will be like in the future," which gets old fast. I just wanted the book to be done with. So I don't particularly agree with this. I don't think that Clarke is necessarily saying this is how the world will be in the future. It's more a case of, if the world is like this in the future, then what? What are the outcomes? If we accept this premise and explore it to the nth degree, where do we get? And I like that premise in science fiction, these kind of big what-if questions. I don't think it's trying to necessarily be as predictive as this reviewer felt it was, and I disagree. I always feel so terrible when I read or attempt to read Arthur C. Clarke, but I also feel terrible when I don't. I like fantasy, I like science fiction. Arthur C. Clarke is a genius, a pioneering, far-sighted sci-fi icon. I should like reading his books, and so I try every once in a while, in the same spirit that I eat half a banana once or twice a year. I like fruit. Bananas are good for you, but I have yet to finish either a banana or an Arthur C. Clarke book. Why is this person having so much trouble finishing a banana? I mean, they're pretty tasty. They're small. It's not that hard to get through them. This person's treating it like it's a marathon. Like, I would make excuses for why I couldn't finish a marathon, but not finishing a banana. They're like the Arthur C. Clarke of fruits. Up next, Solaris by Stanislav Lem. 1 out of 10. This is a geological survey. I don't want to read geological surveys. I wouldn't describe Solaris as a geological survey. If this is how profound geological surveys are, then perhaps I should read more of them. If that 1 out of 10 was a percentage of the book, a tenth of the book reads like a geological survey, I think that would be more of a fair review, but the whole thing doesn't read like a geological survey. How many times are you going to make me say geological survey? What a preposterous review. Imagine the worst info dumps you've ever read. A plot that does not resolve, a mystery with no solution, characters that do not develop, and a scientific endeavor that is completely pointless. There. Now you've imagined this book and don't have to read it. I would disagree with all of these points, although I will say that this isn't the type of book that feels like a mystery novel where at the end the killer is revealed and all the puzzle pieces fall into place. This is a book that is supposed to be thought-provoking and provoke some questions for you to ponder over yourself. So if that's not the kind of sci-fi that you are looking for, Solaris might not click for you, but I really resonated with it. 3/4 of this book could have been footnotes, and the other quarter shouldn't have been written at all. So there are some chapters in Solaris that do feel a little bit footnotey. The character finds sort of clues and writings and journal entries and things like that around the station that they are in, and it did feel like a little bit of a video game to me, where you were kind of hunting for these extras, getting these little tidbits of world building, which maybe weren't the most exciting or entertaining passages for some people, but it wasn't 3/4 of the book. Yeah, it was maybe a tenth. The survey percentage, bring that back. That was about how footnotey it was, and I guess they didn't like the other parts, which I did, but that's subjective. The ratios are not. The ratios are objectively wrong. That's it. I'm done. Did not finish at page 162 because I am sick of trying to force myself to read this train wreck of a book. I know it's a classic. I know many people love Lem's work, but I have no idea what this book was trying to do. Only that it fails to science, fails to engage, and fails to logic on any level. Now that's a pretty crazy place to DNF the book. It's only like 200 pages long. You don't know what the book was trying to say. Just read like 30 more pages. You're almost there. You might have found what you were looking for. I guess if you're not having fun, life's too short to be reading books that you're not enjoying, so DNF a book whenever you feel like it. But I feel like, even though you might not get all the answers you want, I feel like thematically this book sticks the landing, and those last 30, 40 pages might have been worth it. Alright, up next, Ubik by Philip K. Dick. I didn't understand this one. Perhaps too much allegory or whatever? If you prefer straightforward stories, this is not the book for you. This is pretty true. If you are looking for a straightforward story, I would not recommend Philip K. Dick. I would not recommend Ubik, as it's pretty trippy and surreal, and it takes some sharp left turns, so if that's not what you're looking for in sci-fi, I'll point you in another direction. Had a hard time deciding on 1 or 2 stars. Ultimately chose 1. I did enjoy the first part of the novel, but everything after Luna was just too weird, crazy, and hard to comprehend. So this reviewer may have had some similar issues to our previous reviewer, as the nature of reality does start to shift in this book, and that might throw some people off. Although, I wouldn't say it's that hard to comprehend. I feel like PKD's prose is rather readable, but if you are not exactly sure what is real or not real, if that kind of storytelling doesn't interest you, then Ubik's not for you. Pick a plot line, Dick. Goodness, there's like 17 different things going on in this relatively short book. Any one of which would have made a decent story, but altogether, it's like what a child comes back to the table with on their plate after going to Golden Corral. Firstly, this person doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun, because even though I don't have kids and I've never been to a Golden Corral, if and when I do, they are free to come back with wings, steak, mashed potatoes, mac and cheese, meatballs, whatever they want. Put it on the plate and eat it out. Whatever your heart desires, whatever you can put on your plate and in your mouth, that's the whole point of the buffet. That's what you go to the buffet for. So no judgments from me. The only thing getting judged here is this review clearly didn't get Ubik. Yeah, there's a few storylines, but I thought they all came together well, like a perfect plate from the buffet, my friend. Is it possible that an author would throw a novel the same way a boxer would throw a fight? I'm gonna guess what the review is getting at here is that they didn't like the second half or they didn't like the ending. Personally, I really enjoyed the second half of Ubik and I loved the ending. So if I was gonna use a boxing analogy, I would say maybe Ubik gets off to a little bit of a slow start, loses some early rounds, takes a bit of a beating, but then starts to find their feet, shift a pace midway through the fight, comes home strong and knockout finish. Heavyweight champ of PKD books, I say. Ubik. Ubik's my champ. And for our next book, Hyperion by Dan Simmons. This is sort of a retelling of the Canterbury Tales, set in a distant space opera future. It seemed a bit promising in the beginning, but when you come down to it, these are just recycled sci-fi ideas that we've seen before. The plot is disjointed, never comes together. It sets up great mysteries, never explains them, and abruptly ends. Dan Simmons wants you to buy his next book. I hate sci-fi fantasy writers who write long series of books that can't stand alone. I agree and disagree with parts of this. I think this reviewer has fairly accurately described the intent, the nature of the book, although I think the ideas are novel. I found many new things to enjoy in Hyperion, and while each of the stories are written in different sci-fi subgenres, does use a few tropes, I think it explores them in a pretty unique way. In terms of the ending, yeah, the book does kind of end somewhat abruptly. Some people like the way it ends. They think it can stand alone. Personally, I'm Team Fall. I like the fall of Hyperion, so I liked what it set up for Fall, but yes, if you want plot development in the present timeline, you do get a little bit more of that in the sequel. Although I don't think that was Dan Simmons' intent, because supposedly he wrote this as one long book, and the publisher split it into two, so maybe the criticism is pointed in the wrong direction. I could not even continue reading beyond the first few chapters. I find the writing style abhorrent. The sentences are unnecessarily complicated, with words and phrases probably meant to make the world seem extra advanced and science fiction-like, but it was so tiring to read, I just could not bear it. Well, that's a bit of a shame, because in a genre that is not necessarily known for its writing, Dan Simmons is pretty much the best prose writer that sci-fi has to offer, in my opinion, so if it didn't jive with you, then that's not a good sign. I did like the writing style, although I will agree there is a little bit of technobabble, so there's a little bit of a hurdle to get over early on in the book, but after that, yeah, Simmons' writing is a delight. This guy is simply not a good writer. His writing is flat and doesn't grab you. Reading the dictionary is more emotionally gripping. Some of the sci-fi scenery and world-building works, but it is rather thin and one-dimensional. The author does little to develop his world. It's like the sci-fi equivalent of a house for paper dolls. Okay, the writing is flat and doesn't grab you. Well, I cried a couple of times reading this series, so I wouldn't agree with that, and does little with the world building. Well, I am on record as saying that Hyperion is my favorite world building, my favorite universe in all of science fiction, so we are not on the same page. Also, A House for Paper Dolls kind of sounds like a banger title for a sci-fi fantasy book. If Dan Simmons were to write a book with this title, I would read it. I don't know what it's about, but I'm intrigued already. It would be unfair to judge this book as science fiction. It is space fantasy. It is also smutty, violent, and absent a satisfactory conclusion. The constant literary references were really distracting to immersion in the story, and probably meant only to give erections to big John Keats fans. If captured by the Shrike, my torture would be to read this series for eternity. Okay, if I was captured by the Shrike, I would definitely prefer to read Hyperion over and over again for eternity over whatever the Shrike originally had planned for me. I will say though that this review isn't entirely inaccurate. The book is kind of smutty, it definitely is violent, and depending on your perspective, doesn't have a satisfying conclusion. So if you don't like some sort of stronger content in your books, this may not be for you, and if you want a satisfying conclusion, either not the book for you, or just read the sequel, because it's awesome. And just quickly, before we get to our next book, if you have any spicy takes that you'd like to share, feel free to join us on Discord. I'll leave the link to our Discord server in the description for you to, well, you know what, I might need a bit of a pick-me-up after reading all these one-star reviews, so if you enjoyed any of these, feel free to let me know that too, and we'll talk about some more sci-fi books. Alright, moving on, Vurt by Jeff Noon. Quality-wise, I found this novel to be borderline unreadable. A trippy kitchen sink mess of metaphors and allegories and punk that felt like a rant of someone on psychedelics. Yeah, this is pretty accurate. I think actually in my review of this book, I might have even used the phrase that Jeff Noon throws the kitchen sink at the book in terms of the ideas, and yeah, This is a surreal, psychedelic journey that you just kind of have to go along for the ride with. So if that's not your kind of book, you might not jive with it because this book has style. It's a style that's not going to work for everyone, but Jeff Noon really goes for it, and if the style works for you, hopefully it really, really works for you. Worst piece of literature I have come across in my 39 years on this earth. The writing was a complete dumpster fire, and I can't believe I read the entire book. So no DNFing here, we made it to the end, even though it wasn't just the second worst thing we've ever read, we found one where it was the worst thing that someone has ever read. So congratulations, Vurt. I will say that this book is so out there, it takes things to an extreme that I can understand. It kind of has 1-star, 5-star potential. This book will really click for you or not, and for this person it didn't. A sci-fi adaptation of Thick Thighs Saves Lives gone horribly, horribly wrong. When I was lying on the couch sick earlier, I used it to nudge the TV remote closer, and I think that says everything you need to know. Also, I'm fairly certain it's what caused my illness. Maybe all illnesses in the first place. 1 star. Now, this person didn't say this was the worst book they've ever read, but causing all illnesses, that might be an even higher achievement, or a lower bar to clear. Bad thing. It's an even worse thing to say about a book than it's the worst thing you've ever read. I'm not a scientist. I don't think it's true. I'm not sure where pre-1993 illnesses came from. But if all 1993, post-1993 illnesses are caused by Vurt, maybe worth it. It's a pretty good book. Interesting read, but contained too many disturbing topics for my taste. This one's actually pretty fair, and at least they said they thought it was an interesting read, but yes, if this was a movie, it would be an R-rated movie. The content is definitely not going to work for everyone. For me, it kind of pushed things in to an extremity that is more than what I'm typically comfortable reading, and yet that was the magic trick. It was able to make me uncomfortable and yet still enjoy the reading experience. And, what did that say about the book? What does that say about art? What does that say about me? That was all part of the reading experience in Vurt, but I can see why that's not for everyone. Up next, Permutation City by Greg Egan. Stopped on 9%. Author thinks that hard sci-fi is simply about bombarding the reader with unexplained science terms for page after page. Forget about plot and character development, lipids, polysaccharides, peptidoglycans all the way. There is a fair amount of science in this book, and I'm not going to claim that I understood it all, but I don't think you need to. There is definitely an intriguing story with lots of amazing ideas here, and you just kind of have to let some of the science wash over you. Absorb some of it through osmosis, and anything that you don't understand, just keep going, because you'll get to the good stuff. It's very hard to get into the book. It has all the elements of a good novel. It's just that almost every conversation ends in some big debate about philosophy, computer science, subjective thinking, and arithmetic. I just wish that the author would have made the dialogue a bit more realistic, since it really breaks the immersion of the book. Well, yes, those are the main ideas of the book. Those are the topics that the characters talk about a lot, but those are some of the best topics. They were really, really interesting to me. I enjoyed all of those discussions. I really liked exploring those ideas, and that's what I'm coming to science fiction for, and Greg Egan delivers. This book starts well, but I didn't find it as interesting as Quarantine, nor did the central conceit hang together as well. Plus, the characters were annoyingly petulant or implausible, and the ending blurred and messy and not in a positive way. Well, I like the characters and I like the ending, but apparently Quarantine is even better, and I gave Permutation City a 10 out of 10, so if Quarantine is better, a book which I own but haven't read yet, then sounds like I'm in for a good time. 2 question marks. You know what, this is actually a pretty valid review for Permutation City. I might leave a review with something like this, but on a 5-star review, because when I got to the end of Permutation City, yes, it blew my mind. Yes, I wanted to learn more, try and put some of the ideas together in my mind, which had just kind of been scrambled into a soupy mess, but in a 5-star way. Does that make sense? And for our next book, House of Suns by Alistair Reynolds. Can't believe I finished this. Workmanlike writing, flat dialogue, and a wreck of a plot with dreadful pacing. The characters are one note, making it hard to care. Immortality is no surety for maturity, see Greek gods, but some character would be nice. The world building felt rushed, pieced together, giving me no sense of wonder. It's not completely crazy to say that Reynolds' writing is a tad dry, or you're not the biggest fan of his character work, but no sense of wonder? This book gave me more sense of wonder than any sci-fi book I've ever read. You follow 1,000 clones on a story that takes place 6 million years in the future, and the plot spans thousands of years. The scale and scope is epic. No one does it better than Reynolds. No one's as creative as Reynolds. This is a flat-out lie. A 1/4 star for the premise and the whole book, 0 stars for the characters, a 1/4 stars for the story arc, 0 stars for the writing, a 1/4 star for the world building, 3/4 stars in total, rounded up to 1 star. It's kind of funny to me that someone that rates books like this didn't get on with Alistair Reynolds. If you like hard sci-fi, if you have an analytical and logical approach to things, I feel like this is the kind of sci-fi you should enjoy. Also, only a 1/4 star for the premise? Abigail Gentian clones herself 1,000 times, disperses those clones out around the universe. They regather for a reunion every 100,000 years, or is it 200,000 years? It doesn't matter. 200,000 years. 30 reunions later, 6 million years in the future, someone attacks them? Like, this is the greatest premise of all time, a 1/4 star. What are you talking about? Why are you gonna be talking like this? Stay away from this writer. He's a moron. Now, different types of intellect don't necessarily translate into other areas of your life, but to call someone who was actually an astrophysicist a moron is quite the review. The conversations in this book read like 2 software developers going back and forth, one-upping each other with logic. Example, it would do X if Y was obtainable. Other guy says, actually Y is easily obtainable by visiting planet Z. Then back to the other guy, how would you go to planet Z without component A, which means you'd need to do X? And it just seems to go on and on. Zzz. I don't see the problem. I mean, if X, Y, and Z are interesting enough, this isn't a bad way to write a sci-fi book, in my opinion. Boring and weird. I'll half agree, I did not find this book boring, but yeah, it is kind of weird. At one point, when some characters were getting swallowed by these giant entities, I was like, okay, Alistair Reynolds, yeah, whatever you can come up with, I'm down to go on this journey. And for our second last book, The Quantum Thief by Hannu Rajaniemi. Made up words and unexplained characters, races, settings, etc. does not great sci-fi make. And I wish people would understand that. This drivel isn't worth anyone's time. So this actually raises an interesting question about the nature of world building in science fiction, because yeah, an author has to make us feel like we are in their world, but to what extent should they explain things or not explain things? How much exposition is required versus that being distracting and seeming inauthentic or inorganic? Hannu Rajaniemi definitely leans on the side of less exposition. There's a lot of crazy terminology, there's a lot of words, and you kind of have to figure it out as you go along. And that might not be for everyone, but I think it worked. Sometimes you know after the opening chapter that a book just isn't gonna be for you. This is actually pretty true. Often I read a chapter of a book and I'm like, yes, I love this premise, I love this author's writing style, I am on board. And sometimes it's the opposite. Just something rubs you the wrong way. You're not interested in the setup, you don't like the writing style, and you can be proved wrong. Sometimes it starts off great, goes downhill, starts off terribly, you win me over. But yeah, you can get a pretty good sense of a book often within a chapter, I would say. There's no other way to put it. I really hated this book. I read some of the 5-star reviews on Amazon. Mostly they went something like this. Yes, it's hard to follow and not for the intellectually lazy, i.e. the dumb. Oh, of course, I got it. Yeah, that's because I'm like a genius. What? You didn't get it? This was part of my book club reading list, and the entire group hated the book, and almost no one was able to finish it. I would describe it as philosophic technobabble. The writing was so focused on sounding impressive that it forgot to make any kind of progress on the plot. So I would disagree that there isn't any plot progression, although yes, it is presented with a lot of technobabble. It's very funny to me that this was read as part of a book club. I don't know who nominated this book, but the idea of someone suggesting The Quantum Thief, a notoriously hard sci-fi book, to what I'm guessing was not a book club for hard sci-fi fans, is very funny to me. I love the book, but that was a terrible suggestion. Reads like when you keep pressing the predictive text button on your phone. This is very funny. I'm not happy that this person gave The Quantum Thief 1 star, but this is a very good review. And finally, Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. I listened to the audio version of this book and really enjoyed the first 9 chapters, but somewhere in chapter 10 I realized I was trapped in the throes of Andy Weir's own internally comic book man from The Simpsons meets MacGyver voiced fantasy, and I couldn't go along with it anymore. So this isn't an entirely unfair description. I think the main character's a little bit more likable than that. But yeah, he's kind of a nerd, and the premise of this book is basically MacGyver in space. So if that doesn't sound like an interesting premise for you, then maybe don't pick up Project Hail Mary. Every decision made came with another, oh no, what are we gonna do? Problem, to which the solution was oh so conveniently given in a flashback. At this point, it is clear the good guy will always win in Weir's novel, so there is no real tension with any threat. So that is kind of the setup for the novel. We will be presented with a problem, and then we will come up with some cool mathematical or scientific solution. I don't think that it's fair to say there's no tension, because a lot does go wrong in Andy Weir's novels, but I do think he has perhaps a little bit more of a positive outlook on life that is presented in his novels. It's definitely not grimdark, so yeah, I think it does have a bit of an upbeat tone, but there's still a lot of tension in his novels for me. I was going to give it a higher rating, but geez, what an awful ending. Absolutely insulting to the time put in to read it. I liked the ending to Project Hail Mary. I thought it was the perfect ending to this particular story, but I have heard some people be split on the ending, so this isn't completely out of nowhere, but it's not a take I agree with. Every so often I am lucky enough to come across something that reminds me of how beautiful the diversity of the human experience is. For example, some people love this book. I think this is a fitting review to end on, because all of these books were 5 stars for me, but all of these books were 1 star for other readers. And I think that's a good thing, because, you know, if we all just agreed on everything, I think there would be, you know, what would be the point of art? What would be the things that is exploring, trying to get down to the bottom of, the answers, the themes they're exploring, if art was objective and there was a correct opinion and we all just felt the same way about it. We're all different humans, we're all experiencing life differently, we're experiencing art and reading differently, and unfortunately, these guys just got it all wrong, because these books are amazing. Let me know if you agree or disagree, because I really enjoyed these books and I hope you did too, and if you didn't, that's okay, but hopefully some of you in the comments are fans of these books as well. And just quickly, some of you might be thinking, Jonathan, why didn't you do a Kurt Vonnegut book? Well, I think that would just be too painful for me. But if you guys enjoyed this video and you'd like me to see me do something similar again in the future, I'll do some more of my favorite books, reading 1-star reviews, maybe even a Kurt Vonnegut one, if I can stomach it. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash or just gently click the subscribe button. And if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs, like Nima and New Eden, Half-Ogre, Zakawe, Sumil, and the 1-star Colin. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.